In this new series of podcasts, we have been joined by two or three of our favorite commentators on the political scene, on indeed the historical scene as well. And one such is, of course, Victor Davis Hanson, who's with us right now from the West Coast. Good evening, Victor, or rather, good day. I'm not quite sure when this will be heard. Since it's podcast, it will be heard early in the morning and late at night. But anyway, you're very welcome and glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
As usual with you, one is in conflict as to what to talk about. There's always a new and brilliant book. And that one, most recently, just now recently published by you and for you, is The Savior Generals. Fascinating concepts, wonderful mini-histories of generals who saved the cultures for which they were unwelcome military presences, but ultimately became the great heroes. There is always that, and then there is always the current political scene. If you will indulge me, I want to start with that, I guess. That is the current political scene. As we sit here right now, and as we view the crisis of the three scandals, I think of that as sort of a Chinese usage. The three scandals, the four disgraces, and so on. As we face all of that, I'm wondering what moments in history, whether in other recent presidencies, or for that matter way back to the area that you're so familiar with, namely classical antiquity, what moments in history prefigure the present situation in a way that helps us to explain the present situation?
Well, I think we all have precedents for them. The Benghazi scandal, to take the first, is reminiscent of Iran-Contra, because we simply do not know why we had such a sizable CIA contingent in Benghazi. We know that consulate was not a consulate. There was not diplomatic activity going on. We think that we were in some type of program to buy up or store or collect Stinger missiles or dangerous weaponry out of the Gaddafi arsenal. There are rumors that we may have sold Stinger missiles to anti-Gaddafi forces on the mistaken idea they were not al-Qaeda. We know that for some reason we did not want this to be a Mogadishu-like embarrassment before the election, so we did not beef up security when it was requested. We did not send help when it was needed. And we being the government, developed a narrative about a filmmaker's provocative anti-Islamic video that prompted a spontaneous demonstration, which we knew, we being the government again, was not true when we said it was true. So Susan Rice, UN ambassador, Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, Jay Carney, the press secretary, Barack Obama, the President of the United States, for about 15 days said this was a spontaneous demonstration. An occasion, by the way, that would allow the president in politically correct fashion to damn a supposedly Islamophobe filmmaker. None of that was true. The video had nothing to do with the demonstration. It was not spontaneous.
Well, the elite was setting up a cover story,
yes,
covering its embarrassment and its very poor performance. I direct you to classical antiquity, where you've studied everything very closely.
Yes.
Do we find any significant national leaders, whether in Greece or Rome or nearby, having committed a tremendous boo-boo with regard to military affairs and sustained a very significant embarrassment and now looking for a cover story?
Well, I think that the biggest, the most notorious is on the eve of the Sicilian expedition. Alcibiades supposedly profaned the Eleusinian mysteries, dressed up as a woman, mocked them. We don't know to the degree that was true, but his political enemies, in any case, recalled him in the middle of the campaign for the scandal. They tried to cover it up.
We have this directly in Thucydides, isn't that right?
Yes, that's in Thucydides' sixth book of his history, and the result of that was that I think Athens lost the Sicilian expedition because of the recall of Alcibiades, who for all his faults was quite talented. But this is similar to Iran-Contra, I think. The second scandal about the IRS is Nixonian, except Donald Alexander resisted Nixon's interest when he came on board in 1973, interest in using the IRS. So we had a situation where the IRS pushed back against the administration. From what we know in the preliminary details, we get the impression that the IRS is maybe complicit with the administration or out in front of it. So we've never quite had anything quite like that, or freelancing IRS, sort of like T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, that they think that they are going to be rewarded, or they think that they're doing
Who will
something.
rid me of this meddlesome priest?
What's that?
You mentioned T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral.
Yes.
Henry II says, "Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest?"
Absolutely.
And so the errant knights go off and kill Thomas à Becket.
Who's going to help me with the Tea Party? And I think thousands of people across the country, according to their time and space and station, took him up on that.
Yeah.
So that seems to me Nixonian. The AP is a little bit different because in the monitoring of the Fox reporter, maybe the producer, we've had administrations do that before, Nixon, of course. But the difference here is that we've always had a press that was adversarial. For the last 4 years, the press has been deeply embedded and committed to the the Obama administration. But the AP is important because it suggests that the press, while it might tolerate Benghazi and not the IRS, this would be directed against them and their profession. And that would be important because should they turn and revert to their old natural and necessary job as watchdogs of the government, then I think the other two scandals would start to evolve around the way that they usually evolve. If something is wrong, we find out about it.
You know there are constant irregularities in history as well as constant surprises. You're one of our great historians, both of military history and more broadly of political history, and going way back to classical antiquity and down to the present moment. And in the present moment, your weekly commentaries, both in National Review and for the Tribune Syndicate, as a matter of fact, illuminate a great deal concerning what's happening presently. Do you agree with me that in history, inevitably, where there are deep embarrassments to public heroes who are presidents or great leaders, sooner or later somebody turns against them, or sooner or later the forces turn against them, and the new rises to replace the once new and now old? Do you think, I say all of that by way of background to the simple question, does this sound like a changing of the beginning of the changing of the guard? Indeed, does this sound like the beginning of the decline of the democratic hegemony in American politics?
Yeah, I think you're right about the natural waxing and waning of political movements. I think it was Karl Rove in 2003 that said we're looking at a 20-year McKinley-like Republican dominance. Mm-hmm. That was before Iraq and Katrina, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have the other phenomenon of second terms. LBJ met up with Tet in Vietnam. Nixon was Watergate. Reagan had Iran-Contra. Bill Clinton had Monica. There is something about a president gets complacent or he feels that he can afford to be a little bit more arrogant, not return a phone call, not butter up a senator, not invite a congressman over for dinner. Whatever the complacency is, he fails to realize that the second term requires more, not less work, and more renewed vigor than laxity, and that's happened to all second terms. I wrote a column about Obama second term, I think 2 weeks before the inauguration in January, saying that I thought he would have a second term reckoning because there were certain things in the first term, Solyndra, Fast and Furious, the attack on his opponents, the fixation on Fox News, Solyndra, as I said, and then refusing campaign finance and the campaign after he promised to take it, embracing or expanding all of the Bush anti-terrorism protocols after he demagogued it. So there were things that he had evaded, is what I'm trying to say, especially the manner in which Obamacare was passed through.
Nixon paid a heavy price. Some of the other people paid heavy prices. Is Obama going to pay a heavy price? The immediate calculation of that price would be the next coming congressional elections. The fact is, even though he's sort of publicly disgraced, at least in the eyes of many of his former supporters, if you look at the present public opinion polls, he still has favorability ratings of around 53 or 55%.
Yes, he does. And as we speak, Obama won in the political sense, because if you and I had this conversation on September 11th of last year with the Washington Post had him on that date 50-50. And at that time, he was looking at a disaster in Benghazi that morning or that afternoon. And he already had known for about 4 or 5 months that his Attorney General's office had been investigating the AP, and somebody in his administration, we learned lately, had contacted people in the Treasury or vice versa, and they had known the IRS was going after particular groups and individuals, and yet somehow that masterful Chicago politician was able to keep the AP, the IRS, and the true nature of Benghazi quiet until after the November election, and he got reelected. So, so far he's won in the sense that he was able to get away with these things, and the question is now whether the hubris will earn nemesis or not. There's certain things that I think everybody's baffled about. Again, nobody knows what Benghazi was about still. Nobody can figure out why a great American hero like David Petraeus, we learn now, was apprised by the administration that they knew of an affair that he was conducting or had with Paula Broadwell. They knew that in August, and yet he did not resign. And why did he resign right after the election? If it was okay for 5 or 6 months, at what point did it not become okay? And why did his testimony to the House Intelligence Committee about a spontaneous demonstration sort of contradict his talking points, which raises the question, did the administration in Chicago style try to leverage Petraeus, and then after the election was over, they felt that he was expendable?
You just made 2 references to the Chicago-style politics practiced by our current president. Since I'm in Chicago, and though not Chicago-born necessarily, rather deeply invested in contacts with various Chicago figures, including politicians, I can't but go forward to ask you, what really is Chicagoan or Chicago-ish about this administration? What really does one refer to? What do you really refer to when you talk about his Chicago style?
Yes, I refer to it this way. It's a predominantly democratic civic operation that runs a big city, and the prevailing wisdom, or the prevailing ethic, or ethos, I should say, is that the exalted aims, which are identity politics, radical egalitarianism, the liberal agenda, justify any means necessary. And then Chicago, to its admirers, the word Chicago means they get things done, and to its detractors, they'll do anything to get things done, and they justify it because what they get done they feel is better than the alternative, that the liberal vision for America is worth quid pro quo in the most basic, obnoxious, callous sense. And I say that not to be inflammatory, because after all, Obama came to power in the Illinois legislature by suing to get his opponents off the ballot, and having his senatorial opponents in both the primary and general election mysteriously have their divorce records leaked.
Yep.
So he's not a stranger to that style of politics. And I think that when he got on board, there were enough people who convinced him that his agenda was needed and utopian, and so he did pretty much what he thought was necessary to get health care through.
Yeah.
And ever since, it's been the same story. I mean, I can't think of a president that would have something called a TAC Watch, a website where you're supposed to call in or write in and report enemies and say who is the enemy of Obama, and we're going to make a file on them, or have something like Journalist that Ezra Klein ran with the White House, where you report negative journalists and you try to find talking points about them to spread throughout the blogosphere.
Well, as you may remember, the history of your present interlocutor involved an assault by the Obama forces just about a week before the election. I had Stanley Kurtz on with me, who had been doing some very probing investigation of the connections between Obama and Bill Ayers and related matters. And when they got wind of that, in fact, we invited them at headquarters, at the Democratic presidential campaign headquarters, to have somebody from their group come on the program. Instead, that just alerted them that we were doing this, and they sent out emails to hundreds of thousands of people, I would guess, announcing that we were profaning the quality of Chicago radio by doing this sort of thing, that my guest was a low, slinky, and untrustworthy liar, and everybody should protest and try to get me fired, get him off, get Kurtz off the air, and make telephone calls. It was rather startling moment in my long history as a radio performer.
I wrote things critical of the Bush administration, especially the pullback from Fallujah, the way that war was being conducted, the spending too much money. But I never got any critical call. But as this thing comes out about the Obama administration's pursuit of journalists, I was thinking the other day that in the last 5 years I've had 2 letters from the IRS which suggested I owe more money, and both of which were groundless and easily cleared up, but only after I had to get my accountant, pay him some money, write a letter, explain why they were, and they were so absurd that I don't think you needed to be an accountant to see why they were. I mean, they wanted me basically to declare income twice on 1099s, which nobody does.
But of course, hounding people for the income tax problem is not a new phenomenon in American politics.
No,
Years ago, I was closely associated for a while with Hans Morgenthau, a colleague of mine, senior colleague at the University of Chicago, and the two of us were giving talks about the Vietnam War, and we were opposed to the Vietnam War. And Morgenthau, the great realist in political science, a man of great influence, formerly a very active consultant to various governments, was hounded by the Bureau of Internal Revenue for possible income tax faults, evasions, possibly even crimes. That was an attempt to shut Hans Morgenthau up.
But in the post-Watergate period, that was supposed to be part of our fossilized past, and I think that what I'm worried about is now that I start thinking, you mentioned mass emails. When I write a critical column, it's not just that I get all of these posting or emails, but they all seem to be, I don't know, boilerplate. They say they all have a theme. Well, he used to be a good historian, now he's a partisan, so I throw his books across the room, or something like that.
Oh, the scenarios, the scripts are provided by the central office always.
Yeah, they are. And then a book that I have written 9 years ago suddenly will be re-reviewed on a website. In this case, Media Matters, or I'll have an editor politely call me to warn me about something, not against me, but warn me that there might be pressure. Or I've had a state official call me and say, you have no business writing this. And I don't remember any of that under George Bush. I don't remember any of it under Bill Clinton, this first George Bush, Ronald Reagan.
The pursuit of Morgenthau that I just mentioned was under the administration of Lyndon Johnson. Yeah,
I think it was. That's what I'm trying to get at. I think it was in Nixon-Johnson. So in some ways, Obama, I think, came into office saying that I'm an atypical first African-American, first man, true man of the left that we've seen, even more so than Jimmy Carter. I have a vision. Bush is unpopular. I can sort of do what's necessary. And I think he had a lot of zealous young people. They didn't even know what Watergate was, and they unleashed them. And throughout the entire government, the Justice, Treasury, IRS, Health and Human Services, Department of Education, people are doing things that aren't wise right now.
One of the things that Chicago politicians love to quote, I forget what the source is the simple maxim, politics ain't beanbag, meaning all is possible.
The thing that's scary, though, is that it has a deterrent effect, so that if a person wants to donate money to a Republican candidate in 2014, he might say, do I really want to have the scrutiny of my former divorce? Or if a columnist wants to write a particularly critical op-ed, do I really want to deal with my syndicator? Or if
these are chilling effects.
It is, and I think it's worked. That's why I wrote the column today saying Obama won, sort of, because I do feel that people in our own profession as journalists and opinion journalists especially have pulled punches and have been afraid of the consequences. And because they hear things, and they hear that this group doesn't take prisoners and makes it uncomfortable.
Well, then that's an atmosphere, a culture, indeed, of intimidation. And
intimidation, but different than Nixonian, you see, because Nixon was on the right, so they could use this imagery of jackboots and fascists, but Obama's sort of fuzzy left-wing. He's doing it all for us. He's doing it for the people. He has to use these tactics because he wants to give everybody health care, or without this, nobody would have food stamps, or disability insurance would be endangered if he didn't take on the Koch brothers. So it's all wrapped up in this pseudo-ethical veneer. It makes it, and without a free press, press whose voluntarily given up their watchdog role. It makes it unique, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
I was most interested in your reference earlier to General Petraeus. We're about to pause for just a moment. But when we return, that brings me, Petraeus and the mention of him, and the rather sad end to his career, which came upon him rather suddenly. And that brings me directly back to your fascinating new book, The Savior Generals, in which you say, as you generalize about the various generals, that typically the ones who've saved whole armies or whole cultures against what looks like apparent defeat and total defeat, many of them are certainly heroically greeted and heroically encapsulated in the public comprehension for a while, but sooner or later they are somehow rejected again. And their lives very often, their careers often end rather badly. I want to come in just a moment directly to your new book, The Savior Generals. Fascinating stuff. And we return to Victor Davis Hanson after this. And directly back to Victor Davis Hanson. Always a great pleasure for me personally to be talking with you, Victor. And I've been just now reading your new book, which is as fascinating as most of the other military histories you've done, as all of the military histories you've done. The concept here is that coming out of the people or out of the background or off on some distant front of a war which is failing comes a savior general. Ulysses Grant is a good case in point, I suppose.
Yes, it is. And, one of the reasons that I was interested in the topic was that there's all sorts of compendia and surveys of the great generals and even the worst generals in history. We all know why Wellington, Napoleon, Caesar, Alexander were famous, or we try to find the leadership traits that can be translated into business or government. And we even know about the great losers in history. And there's books with titles such as Anatomy of Error, Anatomy of Folly. But I was interested in what if everything was bad? The technology didn't help you. The manpower situation was not good. Morale was not good. Tactics and strategy were negative. In that situation, everything hinged on one man or leadership, so to speak. So I was trying to find situations where I could really distill what pure leadership was.
And these are leaders, military leaders, called in from the provinces, so to speak, or from the back benches.
Yes, none of them were in a position of ultimate leadership or responsibility when the war started.
But there's great disappointment in the ultimate leaders who have failed.
Yes, and they become, knowingly or not, a referendum on everything that preceded them. And they're not popular people, but they're empirical, so they don't get caught up in the popular fervor of a war, either that the war is easily won or is completely lost. They look at the situation empirically and they say this, if you're Ridgeway in Korea, is still in America's advantage, even though there's almost 1 million Chinese now at the 38th parallel. Or if they're Themistocles, they say, yes, Athens is burned down, and yes, the Persians outnumber us 4-1 in their fleet. However, we have these advantages on our side that you're overlooking. So they're very dispassionate and they're very learned students and they don't get caught up in the psychology of consensual government and mass hysteria. But I guess what I'm saying is there's an element of the narcissistic or the arrogant, or that they are a savior. And in the book, I mentioned that tragic profile is common in classical mythology of an Ajax or Achilles, but in our own experience of the Western, a Shane, or Ethan Edwards in The Searcher, or the Magnificent Seven, or High Noon with Marshal Will Kane, all of these people are called on when things are completely lost, and they have particular personality traits or particular personas that are wonderful in times of crisis, but as the crisis passed, and then we sort of get collective amnesia and don't either need them or don't really feel comfortable with them.
Petraeus
didn't end up well.
Petraeus was the cue I was responding to go back into the book. Let me ask you to do this. Let's look at Petraeus and what he accomplished and where he came from and what happened to him. And let's look at the man with whom you start the book, Themistocles, who essentially saves Athens from the Persian invasion.
Well, they were very similar in the sense that Themistocles was not just a half-Thracian renegade popular demagogue, as his opponents all the way into the Plutarch tradition suggested. He had fought at Marathon 10 years earlier. He had been an archon. He was the architect of the idea of using the silver at the mines of Laurium to build a fleet. Thucydides said what made him great was he was prescient. He could see things that were going to unfold in the future. So he was the idea that a rural, parochial, sort of agrarian state, Athens, could become a radical democracy without a property qualification and run the Aegean if it had a fleet and if the poor who rode in the fleet were empowered fiscally and socially and politically. So, and that vision then bore fruition when he was able to use his force of personality to convince the Greeks that even though 2/3 of Greece was lost by September 480, and even though the Peloponnesian area alone was still free, they still had to fight north of the Peloponnese and in Attica, or otherwise he either was going to leave or the Athenians were going to leave, or if the Athenians were defeated, then there would be just a matter of time before the Peloponnesian was subdued. So
and it all comes to the crucial point in a naval battle at Salamis.
Yes, he was able to convince the Spartans and the Peloponnesians to fight with him, even though they were outnumbered 4-1. He was able to get in a lead trireme while his counterpart Xerxes was in a golden throne on a mountain above the battle. And he was able to frame the battle as freedom of people defending their own homeland against subjects of an imperial aggressive power. And he won. And after winning, he allowed the momentum to change, and then, sort of according to the script, he starts to either become arrogant, or he becomes megalomaniac, or he earns too many enemies, but his influence starts to diminish. And in the next 20 years, although all of his ideas are embraced by his successors, he's not given credit for them. He ends up very bitter in Persia, of all places, where he commits suicide at 65. I wrote this book startled that Belisarius, the great Byzantine captain, who was the second chapter's hero, ended up as a beggar on the streets of Constantinople, some traditions blind and impoverished. Matthew Ridgeway, the fourth chapter, was probably, I think, the greatest American soldier of the 20th century, but he got on the wrong side of Omar Bradley, got on the wrong side of Dwight Eisenhower, was forced to retire at 62, not used as a consultant, got people angry at him for his candor, and although he lived to be 98, he didn't get the Medal of Freedom until he was 93, and he was forgotten.
You just called him what, the greatest military commander in modern American history?
Absolutely.
Support that. Make that case.
Well, we forget that in World War II and the three great battles the Americans participated in Europe, the Normandy campaign, the Bridge Too Far disaster in Arnhem, and the Battle of the Bulge, he was in all three of them and played a prominent role as an airborne corps commander. And then he was proconsul of the Mediterranean. But when he went to Korea in December 27th of 1950, there was no North Korea. It had already been absorbed by communism. I mean, MacArthur's dash to the Yalu River had been over now, longest retreat in American military history. Probably 500,000 Chinese had crossed from Manchuria and destroyed the U.S., basically the U.S. presence in North Korea.
Well, the South Korean capital, Seoul, was in danger of falling within days.
And it would fall within 2 weeks of his arrival.
Yeah.
His commanders were demoralized. There was not hot food. There was not mail. People were expecting Ridgeway to conduct a strategic retreat from Pusan again, out of the entire peninsula, perhaps to the Philippines or Japan. So he arrives. The senior commander has been killed in a Jeep accident, General Walker, and suddenly MacArthur's in a political war blaming the Truman administration for this disaster rather than his own laxity. And this man says on arrival, who had never been to Korea or Japan, basically, I don't want to hear about retreat. I don't want to hear about defeat. They're overextended more than we were when we were in the north. They're in the south. The same conditions apply to the Chinese as applied to us, except we were better supplied. We have now air superiority with the F-86s arriving. We can resume direct bombing. We have superior artillery. Everything is in our favor, and that was just considered lunatic. All we need is a return to morale. I'm going to give you talking points. This is why we're in Korea legally, politically, socially, economically, philosophically. I'm going to tell the American people why we're here. We're going to allow them to crash against fortified lines. We're going to really make them pay a terrible price. We're going to get across the 38th parallel. And that just seemed lunatic, as I said, and he accomplished that in 100 days.
How did he do it? Was it a matter of, in some significant part, of his inspiring the otherwise disgruntled and
he was like Petraeus, Themistocles. I mean, they called him Old Iron Tits because he wore a grenade on one breast and a medical kit on the other.
Huh.
And he physically got out in the front, and it was very cold in the winter, and he got in a Piper Club and flew over the battlefield. He made any commander who wanted to keep his position move up to the front with him. He marched up and down. He was armed, and he told the average soldier, from private all the way up to 3-star general, that he was a combatant like they were. He asked people if they got enough to eat. He told them they were winning. He kept reminding them, you do not understand the amount of punishment we are inflicting on the enemy. They are not going to sustain this. We are much more lethal than the enemy is. We're much better equipped. We're much better fighters. And people had just swallowed as gospel the idea of the invincible Red Army, which they'd never encountered before. And it was an amazing turnaround. And then he got even more controversial when he got to the 38th parallel, even actually north of it. He said, now, I don't think this country's up for another dash to the Yalu River and trying to occupy all of North Korea with limited amounts of forces, and China and Russia in this area of the world very hostile, and they'll invade again. So let's stop at the 38th. And if he was hated for saying that we could get back to the 38th, and then he was hated again for saying we shouldn't go back beyond the 38th.
Victor, you remember that behind my nighttime or off-time vocation of broadcaster, my real vocation over the long years has been professor of psychology.
Yes.
Let me play psychologist for just a moment. What's so interesting about Ridgeway and about the various others in your book is that as perceived by the people around them, they may well have seemed to be, quote, delusional, though I don't know how you say that in Greek, but that they must have said of Themistocles, this guy's nuts, these are impossibilities. But still, the controllers of the society yield and give him his bit, or give him his opportunity to go and act out his delusion, and at least then we will have tried everything. But delusional ideation, if deeply, deeply held and firmly held with a profound but unjustifiable conviction, very often somehow verifies itself, very often reinforces itself, and makes victory possible, though no one would have predicted victory. Is that part of what's going on with all of your people?
I think that's true, and I think that they're convinced if they get the chance that their careful scrutiny of what has transpired, all of their experience, all of their education, all of their emotions can be focused in a situation that's not lost. But people, as I said, find them delusional. But in a way they are, as you also suggest, they are a little delusional, because by any empirical standard, if you look at it, most people think that the battle is lost, because nobody would be willing to sacrifice their entire career to take that risk and to tell people that you could win a war that was written off. And you have to be sort of a tragic, in the Greeks' way of thinking, if it was Homer or Sophocles, they would say that these are tragic heroes. In other words, that they understand that the price of success is going to be personal destruction in the long term.
Now, reading the Savior Generals, one thought persisted in me, namely, I wonder if possibly somebody else you should have had there, except he had a much longer run, would have been Napoleon himself. He surely had somehow the delusion of his absolutely unresistible military power, even against forces that on paper or on the battlefield analysis looked to be far stronger and better equipped than his. But
I had this criteria, and I looked at Napoleon or especially Caesar and Alexander, because
yes,
all of them had moments of just utter disaster, which they recovered from. But with the choice, I didn't name the book The Recovery Generals, but rather The Savior Generals, because I thought savior, whether we like it or not, has an ethical component. Suggests they not only saved something, but they themselves had a vision that should have been saved. In other words,
they represented something good.
Difference that the Greeks and not the Persian one.
Yeah.
I think by any standard, the Byzantine civilization was superior to the Vandals. I think that North Korea was not worth saving, or should not have absorbed South Korea. I think the Union had a better vision than the Confederacy.
But what about an army guided by the mythology of the French Revolution, now spreading out to essentially conquer all of Europe?
Well, if you're Dominique Villepin, who wrote, Cry of the Gargoyle, that 100 Days of Napoleon, he was the visionary of the first EU, so to speak.
Yeah.
European Union based on revolutionary egalitarianism. But I'm more of the view that he hijacked some of the elements, the best elements of the revolution, and perverted them and used some of the worst methodologies to achieve his dictatorial visions. Napoleon, in some ways, was egalitarian and Republican in the way that he advanced officers. He got rid of titles. But for what purpose? It seemed to me that ultimately he was monarchical, authoritarian.
Well, he also arranged for the killing of millions unnecessarily.
Yes, he did. He had a bad habit of leading his army into the most wretched of conditions, whether it's in Egypt or outside of Moscow, and then leaving them to die.
And yet, even to this day, revered. If you go to his tomb in the middle of Paris, Frenchmen are still standing around, deeply moved at his tomb.
Yes, they are, because one man, they feel, took French culture and turned it from a national culture to a continental culture.
Yes. Let me come to one other figure in your book that I found your portrait of him fascinating, nor did I know his story all that well, namely General Sherman.
Yes. Well, I've written about his march to the sea after the election, but I had not written about his Atlanta campaign. And we should remember that for all the glory of Vicksburg and Gettysburg in 1863 and the 4th of July, that had been a year in the past. And since then, everything for the North had gone badly. And so when Grant and Sherman took dual control, East and West, in March of 1864, the momentum had not been good. And so Grant had promised Lincoln that he was going to get to Richmond and Sherman would get to Atlanta before the election. And that would be an iconic twin victory, and then Lincoln would be elected in November of 1864, and George McClellan, the Copperhead candidate, would fail, and the Union would then succeed in the idea of a non-slave owning unity. But unfortunately for Grant, Robert E. Lee proved as brilliant a defending general on the defensive as he was inept as an offensive general. So he wasn't very good about going into Pennsylvania without ruining his army, but he was very good making Grant pay a high price of 3 men to every 2 that, or 4 even, that every 2 that Lee lost. And the result of it is, after these nightmarish places like Cold Harbor, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Petersburg, the Army of the Potomac was not the same in, say, August as it had been in May. 100,000 casualties. Horace Greeley in the New York Herald calling for Lincoln not even to run, to hand the baton over to John C. Fremont. No chance he would be elected in November should he get the nomination. Meanwhile, Sherman is plodding along from May toward Atlanta, and while Grant is like a ram butting his head, Sherman is outflanking Joe Johnson, outflanking him, not losing very many people, slowly getting 2, 3, 4 miles closer to Atlanta every day.
Was he a particularly cruel general, cruel towards the population that he penetrated? You know that's part of the American myth.
Absolutely. Cruel toward part of the population. I would refine that, the part of the people who owned slavery and he felt were culpable for starting the war, but not the 97% who didn't own slavery but were being bled white in Virginia for the idea of slavery. So in his way of thinking, I don't really want to fight a Southern army because I don't want to kill a bunch of people who didn't own slaves and were deluded. I want to get into Atlanta. I want to get into the bowels of Georgia. I want to make Georgia howl. I want to make ruin and war synonymous to the plantation class. And he did that in those 3 great campaigns to Atlanta, and then after the election to Savannah, and then up to the Carolinas. But as Machiavelli said, a man will forgive you if you kill his father, but not his patrimony.
Yeah.
So he was hated for destroying property and not lives. He probably killed no more than 10% of this number that Grant killed in Virginia, and he probably lost, a third of what Grant lost. But yet he was considered making war cruel and harsh and barbaric.
It's interesting to compare those 2 post-war careers, Grant and Sherman. Grant, of course, goes on to be President of the United States, though maybe ultimately that is a source of dishonor as well as of attainment. And we know that he ended virtually impecunious with Mark Twain guiding him in the writing of that wonderful memoir. But Sherman is out there in the West after the war, still a cavalry officer, so to speak.
He was very magnanimous. He kept saying to everybody, don't blame Grant for losing so many soldiers. It was part of a larger strategy. Whether that was true or not, it's debatable. But he said, Grant tied Lee down and went head on, and I went around the flank, and they were complementary strategies. Neither one of us could have been Sherman. We couldn't have both been Shermans. We couldn't have both been Grants. And when that hit the papers after he took Atlanta on September 2nd, the natural inclination was people to look at Grant and say, see, Grant, you destroyed your army. You didn't get to Richmond. You should have done what Sherman did. And Sherman very, as I said, magnanimously stood up and said, no. He tied Lee down. Lee couldn't go over and help Atlanta. It was all pre-planned. Just had different styles. And now we're going to be working more harmoniously as I go into Savannah. So he really saved Grant's reputation.
Victor,
and Lincoln the election.
We're almost out of time. I note that despite all of your work as a military historian, you've not lost a kind of deep respect for the major figures in military history. It's as if they are, if not a breed apart, at least a breed worth some special admiration and some special understanding.
Well, I think that the way I look at a lot of these great generals is they feel something has gone wrong for war to break out. That war breaks out when some nefarious character feels that he has more to gain than lose, and there's not enough deterrence or military preparedness to stop him, whether it's 1939 or 1914 or 1861. And so their duty is to try to defeat somebody who should be defeated and do it as quickly and as economically as possible. But they were not the people responsible. That was a diplomatic and political decision to allow these people to be in the predicament that they caused other people to be in. And so I don't see them as people who were lovers of war or lovers of blood or lovers of carnage. Usually, if you read Sherman's biography or what Patton said, or even Curtis LeMay, they feel that they shouldn't have been in a war had they been militarily strong enough to deter an adventurous enemy.
We've come to the end of the available time. It's always, as always, it has been a great pleasure and indeed a learning occasion for me. I thank you so much for joining us and for the excellent new book. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Me too.
Take care.